Tom Wood is a well-decorated senior officer who has built a successful career in the Scottish Police Force, formerly serving as Deputy Chief Constable in Lothian. He is also a true crime author, and the title of his most recent work is Ruxton, the First Modern Murder. Ruxton details the pioneering forensic work carried out by forces during the 1930s investigation of a gruesome double murder, and draws upon previously classified documents to build a detailed, engaging story about criminal investigation and justice. Tom Wood is also well known for his regular column Inside Justice, published in the Scotsman, and for his lecturing across the country. Tom, take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm always very pleased to be introduced as being well decorated. It sounds like I've been just given a coat of emulsion paint, which probably I need. But I'm very pleased to be asked to speak tonight. The future of the Scottish Police Service has given me a great opportunity to sit back and reflect on, my service and what's coming over the hill. And as part of that, I started to look in the last 2 or 3 weeks at what was in the media about the police. And I've got to say, my general impression was most of it was a load of nonsense. Assumptions, stereotypes, generalizations, and a complete ignorance of the criminal justice system. Just in the last 3 weeks, the police service has been individually blamed for the societal disintegration at the end of the last miners' strike. No mention of any other part of the criminal justice system, no mention of the National Union of Mine Workers, no mention of the Coal Board, just the police service. No, I was there, and none of us wanted to be there, and it's a ridiculous stereotype. Then, just last week, we were blamed for the failures in the Peter Sutcliffe investigation. And that's a fair cop, actually. I think probably the police service has a lot of responsibility in that case. And so, fair enough. And I thought the coverage of that was very accurate. And then just 2 days ago, I was surprised to read a quote from the Eilish Angelini, the former Lord Advocate, who did a report into complaints in handling of complaints in the police service. And the headline was about institutional racism. Now, I gave evidence to that inquiry. And so I was very surprised. So I started to read the inquiry, all 500 pages of it, to discover there's a tiny reference to racism in individual officers, nothing to do with institutional racism. And that sort of stuff is extremely dangerous, because I think it devalues the arguments, the very, very serious arguments there are around about policing in Scotland in the future. And so that's the reason why I think this is a very, very important night, because we chance to have a truthful and very frank discussion about some of the real issues. And we should be grateful, and I know all the 3 speakers are grateful to Ringwood and to Book Week Scotland for allowing us this opportunity. Let me make one thing clear from the start. 80% of police work is not about crime, not about murder, not about robbery, not about rape, not about drugs, not about any of these things. 80% of police work is social care, is looking after child welfare, is looking after missing old people, is looking after people who are suffering from mental illness. Now, I know that Simon's going to touch on this later, so I don't want to steal his thunder, but that's a huge issue, which I think in the future we're going to have to tackle. The police service is not perfect, and the people in the police service are not perfect. We've all made mistakes, we all make mistakes, and every day and daily police officers make mistakes. But consider this, that right now out in the street, making decisions, quite important decisions, life or death decisions sometimes, are a group of very young men and women, 22, 23 years old. They're in highly stressed situations. People are injured and anxious and sometimes very violent. People are very disturbed. It's at night and it's always raining. And while I was the DCC of Lothian and Borders Police and had to look at complaints and conduct and discipline, I used to think about that. And I used to marvel how often they got the decisions right. Not how often got them wrong, but how often they got them right. What I want to do tonight is take a glimpse into the future. You're mad if you think you can look too far into the future, because who would have predicted that we'd be doing what we're doing now in 2020? I'm going to try and look forward 10 years, and I'm going to try and look at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats that face the Scottish Police Service. I was a career policeman. I joined very young, and I served for 36, 37 years. I started off when personal radios were a gimmicky new thing. And by the time I retired, cybercrime was becoming a real and present danger. When I joined, there were a handful of police women in the force, and they dealt with specialist matters like children and sexual offences. When I left, over 30%, close to 35% of our strength were women in all ranks. And what a huge improvement that had been over my service. I worked first in the train spotting era when heroin came to Scotland at first, and that kind of defined my generation's service. Again, I know Simon's going to talk a bit about this, so I'm going to say no more about that, except that that was one of the huge societal changes that affected my police service and my generation and the generations that followed me. After I left the police, for most of my service, I was involved in the CID, and that was my first love, and I was very, very lucky to spend a lot of my service in the CID, and I finished up leading a big national inquiry into the deaths of 5 young women in Scotland in the 1970s, a historical inquiry, including the World's End murders. And of course, I wrote a couple of books about the World's End murders after that. So I was hugely privileged to be able to do that work. And it was a great sort of end stop to my police service. After that, I worked in adult and child protection, I worked in alcohol and drug strategy, and then I began to write. And I wrote the books about the World's End murders to make sure the story was told accurately. I didn't want that investigation to be defined by a tabloid headline. And that's really the reason I started to write. I started to do that, wrote a couple of books about the World's End, then started to write columns for the Scotsman about justice matters, and then was handed case papers regarding Ruxton behind me there. The Ruxton case was the most important criminal investigation in the 20th century, no question about that. Not because of the case, not even because of the brilliant work that was done to solve it, but because of its legacy, because it literally defined the way that we investigate crime now, today. It all started at the Ruxton case. And that's what interests me. I'm interested in turning points. I'm interested in things developing. I'm interested in asking the question, why some things went one way and some things went the other way. My next book is going to be about the sex industry, because I think that's also one of the great taboos in Scotland, about how we look on, how we accept, how we police, how we regulate, how we care for sex workers and people who work in the sex industry. So I'm working on that now. So I want to start, and I want to start by talking about policing by consent. Now, policing by consent, I've always thought sounded like a sort of a cheesy strapline from an ad campaign, but actually it's much more important than that. It's the very foundation of the way that we police, and has been since modern policing first came into being 200 years ago. Is deliberately designed to be a careful balance, as a compromise, regulated by a whole lot of silken threads of accountability. And from the start, it was a civilian force, and it's remained that way ever since. We stay at arm's length from anything military. But the goal was for the police to be the public and the public to be the police. And when you boil it down, that's the way it still has to be. There's only one police officer for something like 325 members of the public in Scotland as we speak. And that means that what the police service does has to have the public approval. And I'll come back to this in a minute. It's important because as the police service goes forward and becomes more specialised, we shouldn't forget that we need the public approval and that we need to continue to provide public service. Now, there's a whole lot of bodies that control the police service, no single one, but a whole lot of strands of accountability, the police authority, the courts, the Inspectorate Constabulary, and even the Justice Department at the Scottish Government. But throughout that, the Chief Constable himself or herself always has direct operational jurisdiction. There's no question about that. The Chief Constable always takes the decision on operational matters. And that was sewn in right at the start. It was very, very straightforward and very, very meaningful, but very important. And that remains sacrosanct to this day. And we should be grateful for it when it does, because in many other developed countries, like the United States, there's a fair bit of political control on police chiefs and police commissioners. Many of them serve at the leisure of the political masters, and that's a road to destruction. I want now to look at the new model of policing Scotland. 7 years ago, there was an enormous change in that the 8 police forces were joined together into one, Police Scotland. And I have to admit that at the time, I was very wary of it. I thought we'd been better going to 4 forces or 3 forces rather than one big national force. But when you look at the figures, the reason it was done was purely economical. It was recognised that we were going into a period of austerity, and not even 4 or 5 forces was viable. We had to amalgamate into one police service. And there was a business case objective of delivering about £1 billion in savings by 2026. In fact, by the time 2026 comes along, there will have been £2.2 billion taken out of the police budget for Scotland, the old 8 forces police budget. Even so, there are 23,000 staff still in Police Scotland with a total budget of £1.2 billion. I don't mean to blind you with figures, but that's a big, big business. It's a lot of public money, and police service have got to, I almost said we, the police service have got to demonstrate continuously that A, they're supporting and reflecting the community they served, and that B, they're providing decent value. But there's a problem. Much more money was taken out of the system than was first envisaged. And so we now have a structural deficit every year in Police Scotland of £78 million, which means that every year we are unable, or they are unable, to meet their budgets and must go cap in hand to the Finance Secretary to look for a top-up of money. Now, just translate that to your own domestic budget and see where you end up. It is a very, very, it's an undesirable position to be in. But no one can question the best value argument of Police Scotland. Police Scotland saves £200 million a year over the old 8-force model, £200 million a year. And as I said, is now on track to way over the top to deliver what it set out to deliver. Right, well, the first chapters of Police Scotland were not exactly glorious. There were some very clumsy, heavy-handed management in the early days, but I'm pleased to say that under new and much improved leadership, Police Scotland has emerged from this long, dark tunnel of radical change. And now it stands in a very good position. It's a real strength because it's been through that ringer of change. And I think that the 14 health boards in Scotland and the 32 local authorities, yes, 32 local councils in Scotland, would do well to note, because I think that eventually, surely eventually, that kind of change will come to them as well. I think it's also a strength and a good position for Police Scotland to be in, to be able to influence and to be able to set an example of how these changes can be made. It's not been easy, but they've done it, and they deserve some praise for that. Now, I'd like to move on and talk about checks and balances before we look at the prospects for performance. At the moment, as I said in my introduction, there are various strings of accountability. There's the Scottish Police Authority, there's the PERC, the Complaints Authority, there's the Lord Advocate, there's the Deputy Chief Constable, etc., etc. The one big change has been in the old police board structure. Under the Eight Forces, the police boards were all locally manned or womaned by local councillors, elected members from the area. And so they reflected what the policing priorities were in the areas that they came from. So you had Grampian, you had Northern, you had Strathclyde, you had Lothian, you had Fife, etc., etc. That no longer exists. And now you have a Scottish Police Authority, which comprises of appointed people from the Scottish Government, from the public appointment support. Now, the problem with that is that they don't have any kind of democratic mandate at all. And I think this has opened a void between local communities and their police service. I think that not having their local elected members have a say in what's happening in the police service, I think that's a weakness. Because no matter the quality of the new Scottish Police Authority, the truth is that they're not elected, they're accountable to no one, and it places a distance between the police and the community. Remember what I said about policing by consent. There's also a danger, of course, in that the police become too close to the government, Scottish Government, which is a very powerful and very controlling government. Let's be clear about that. Let's be frank about that. Now, of course, there's huge advantages to a police service being close to government in terms of influence, especially when you've got to go every year and ask for more money. But there's a threat. And that threat is that they start to dictate what the Chief Constable does and what the force does operationally. And I think that as the police service become more and more involved in political matters, whether it be allegations against politicians, etc., I think that's a real risk. And I think it's going to be one of the major tests of the National Police Service, whether it truly keeps its independence and can keep that distance together, but not too close with the Scottish Government, who are their funding masters. So what's the story so far? Let's have a little reality check on the story so far. How's it gone? Well, as I said, even the most ardent supporters of the new structure would have to admit it's been a rocky start. Hardly surprising, you might think. Changes of this magnitude be not expected to be painless, and they were not painless. They were not painless for a whole lot of people that worked in the organisation. And there's a lot of bruises still amongst former police staff, particularly civilian staff, very loyal civilian staff in the police service who found their jobs disappearing. The current Chief Constable has been very candid, and he said that in the early years, and I quote, Police Scotland, mistakes were made when consistency and integration were prioritised against compressed timescale. In other words, a bull in a china shop approach was taken, and I think that's right. And of course, that has resulted in a lot of broken crockery and a lot of broken people. So how's it settled down now? Well, we had two very short-term Chief Constables. We had, I think, 3 chairs of the Scottish Police Authority that came and went, and it's now settled down. And I'm pleased to say it's coming along nicely, much, much more positive in terms of the feelings of the workforce. Have there been improvements? Yes, there have, particularly in the area of serious crime, which of course I have a particular interest in. Much more professional, much more consistent than in the old structure of 8 forces. Well-trained and well-equipped officers from one of the regional major investigation teams are quick on the scene of any serious crime, and the forensic backup is absolutely superb. I often wish that I'd had that kind of support when I was an SIO investigating serious crimes, is they've also been able to do things which they couldn't have done in the old structure. They've built, at the cost of £73 million, no less, the Scottish Crime Campus at Gartcosh, which is an absolute model of up-to-date technology. DNA 24, which is called as a forensic science capability, is the most advanced profiling facility in Europe. And that is an enormous strength. And I last wrote about the Ruxton case behind me here, which was the dawn of forensic science. And it's really pleasing to see that Scotland has kept up that pace and is now once again right in the front of forensic criminal detection. But there have been downsides as well. And as I said, many communities still feel they have lost touch with the local police. And as more specialist demand arises, so local resources are being drawn down. And I think this is a threat. It's recognised as a threat. The Chief Constable has spoken about it as a threat. But I think how that's managed will in some ways reflect the police service, the future and the success of the police service as it goes forward. In summary then, the police have been through the mincer of radical change, and they've had 7 years of trials and tribulations, and they have come out now blinking, but much leaner and fitter. We should hope that the budgetary acts of the Scottish Government is aimed somewhere else, because I don't think it's practicable, having lost the amount of resources that they have lost, and with increasing demand, that they'll be able to continue with this level of service if there are more cuts. I think they're down to the bare bones. That would be my honest opinion. Can I move on and just talk about the political climate? No public service can thrive out with a stable political and economic environment. So it's important that we have a quick look at that. The economic prospects look bleak, frankly. Even if we do get a vaccine, even if one of these vaccines that's been successful comes to fruition, it's still going to be 2024 until we start to see an improvement in our economic conditions. So there's a long dark tunnel ahead of us, and I think that all public services are going to suffer in the interim. In terms of politics, we've never been more polarised in Scotland. I think the rise of nationalism on both sides of the border have fed a toxic discourse, made a lot worse by the unfiltered poison channeled through social media. And I think social media and the new media is a big factor in policing, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. There now exists a probability that there will be another Scottish independence referendum in the next 3 to 4 years. Some people say it's next year, some people say 3 or 4. Let's be generous and say 3 or 4. If this does come to pass, what are the likely consequences for policing, and particularly public order? Well, first of all, it seems likely that whoever wins, if then any winner emerges, whether it be unionist or separatists, then the side that loses will deny that they have lost. That's what happened in 2014. And that is likely, I think, to lead to a rise in public order. Public order problems are already rising. Assaults on police and emergency service workers have never been higher and are growing at an exponential rate. The 1970s was the most violent decade in our history up to now, but I think this decade might match it. And to add to that, at the end of next year, we are going to be in Glasgow hosting a climate change conference, COP26. And they're talking about it now offhandedly in the media, etc. COP26 is going to be the biggest public order and organisational challenge that Britain has dealt with in living memory. Much bigger than the London Olympics. It's going to be enormous. Every head of state, every climate change activist, every anarchist for miles around will come to Glasgow. And it will be an enormous event. It's very, very hard to overstate the enormity of that. And the consequences of that are likely to last for some time. Let's look at climate change, since we're talking about the climate change conference. We've already seen the consequences of climate change in this decade. Weather pattern changes, torrential downpours, unprecedented flooding, long periods of dry weather, and we've seen enormous fires in other parts of the world, and they will come to us surely. I think that Police Scotland are pretty well equipped to deal with this because of they can rapidly deploy people, trained people with equipment to these hotspots, literally. But the response to these disasters is always a partnership enterprise. And like all partnerships, the effectiveness of the whole depends on the strength of its component parts. And I do wonder whether the now much stripped down local authority structure can actually sustain that kind of commitment over time. And that could be a threat to the whole enterprise. Cybercrime. Well, very few things change in the nature of policing. If you look back over the last 150 years, motor transport and railways changed things in the 19th century. Drugs changed things out of all recognition for my generation and Simon's generation. And cybercrime will change it yet again for the generation we're in now. Already, as we speak, cybercrime has gone up during the pandemic, during the lockdown, by over 100%. The truth is, we don't know the extent of cybercrime. Most victims of cybercrime don't realise they are victims and don't report them. But what we do know, if that's the tip of the iceberg, then the rest of the iceberg is of enormous size. And that's going to be changing the way that the police service does business. We'll have to have a lot more specialised resources put over to the investigation of cybercrimes. And the question then is, well, where does that come from? And we come back to this vicious circle of removing operational policemen from the street. Now, the one good news about cybercrime is because of the size and the capability and the capacity of Police Scotland, I think we're ahead of the game in some respects, but I think it's a very, very long and a very, very different game. And I think that will be the challenge. When 30 or 40 years from now on, as old cops like me are speaking about their service and the challenges that face them, they'll be talking about cybercrime. And they'll be talking about the difficulties they had in dealing with that. But serious and organised crime will not go away. That's the problem. New problems arise, old problems fail to go away. The main battlefields of the future may well be cyberspace, but the old enemies will not disappear. They will adapt to new markets and opportunities. If it's, as predicted, a major economic downturn follows, people trafficking will increase. It's already very high. We're already seeing it in every part of Scotland. It will increase. And we will have to deal with large numbers of displaced persons coming here, either as economic migrants or marketed into the sex industry, which is the traditional place that they end up. And new crimes will emerge. Already in mainland Europe, the illegal disposal of toxic waste is common and is considered a very, very important crime priority. I think we'll see a lot more of that in this country too. Terrorism and historic investigations, they won't go away. There's no chance that either Islamic or other forms of terrorism will decrease in the next 10 years. And historic investigations will continue. This is one of the great drains, the great unseen drains of the police service, is actually staffing these huge and growing historic investigations into sexual abuse and other matters. And I think that will continue into the next decade. Just want to say one or two final words now. Very importantly is about partnerships. Much of police work is done in partnership. Some are quite apparent, like the partnerships in the criminal justice system with the courts and the Crown and the prisons, etc. And others are not so obvious, like the partnerships in drug or child protection work, where the commitment of local authorities and social services and health services are absolutely crucial to success. As a recession bites and as public spending comes under pressure, these partnerships may well come under strain. When partnerships step back, there's a tendency for the police to step forward to fill the void. It's always been that way, and I remember it in the initial stages of the drugs war. We did that. It's a kind of can-do attitude, which is very commendable in some ways, and it's a major weakness in other ways, because the balance and effectiveness of partnerships is vital to the future of Police Scotland. So should there be a withdrawal or reduction in commitment by any of the partners, the effectiveness of the whole will be threatened. There are things that the police can't do. There are things in child protection work that the police cannot do. We're not trained to do it, haven't been trained to do it. And there's things in drugs and alcohol partnerships that the police cannot do either. If we try to do it, then it'll not be satisfactory, and the whole system will break down. So just to conclude, in this very brief synopsis of Police Scotland's prospects for the next 10 years, I've tried to make my gaze as wide and as focused, if that's not counterintuitive, as possible. From structure to scrutiny, from funding to emerging threats, there appears to be what I would call an aggregate of challenges over the next 10 years, which if not met early will soon become threats. I think 10 years out, if the police service marches towards them and gets itself sorted out, we might cope. The country might cope. If we allow them to overwhelm us, I think we're in trouble. The combination of structural funding deficit, I come back to this is not a good situation to be in. We are always over budget. The combination of structural funding deficit and increasing demand in the areas of public disorder and cybercrime will eventually compel Police Scotland to face difficult choices. And I always say, that the first law of physics says you can't do more of one thing without doing less of another given the same resource. There's a bit of wriggle room in an organisation like Police Scotland, but there's not much. The police service is nothing if not adaptable, but ultimately increasing demands can only be met at the cost of something else. The question is, what will that something else be? Traditionally, the police service has responded to increasing demands in specialist areas by taking resources from the street, from response and community policing. This is a huge trap and an ongoing threat, since the whole foundation of policing, by consent, I come right back to the start, is based on an effective community-based police service. Looking at Police Scotland in the round, there's much to be optimistic about. I think they've been radically reformed, now modern. I think they're well led. I think they've got a motivated workforce, an impressive track record, particularly in the field of serious crime. The threat of inadequate funding and increasing demand, I think I've banged on about that long enough. But ultimately, it will be how that circle is squared, how these challenges are met, that will decide the future success of the police service in Scotland. There has never been a greater need for evidence-based honesty. And what do I mean by that? I mean, not just flippant talk, not just posturing, not just throwing things against the wall and see if they stick, not just unfounded stuff, honesty, frankness and honesty. And I've enjoyed this process tonight. I've enjoyed researching and looking at these issues from afar, because I think it's a hugely important subject. And I'm really pleased that Ringwood and Book Week Scotland have given us the opportunity to discuss it in this kind of friendly environment. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tom. I would like now to introduce our second speaker. Rob McInroy is the author of Cuddy Strip, a novel based on true crimes that occurred in 1930s Perth in Scotland. His storytelling draws several parallels between the historical case and the present-day issues of police bias and bigotry, as well as the discriminatory treatment of sexual assault survivors by the justice system. Rob has won numerous competitions for his short stories, including HISAC, Chip Lit Fest, Writing Magazine, and the Bedford International Writing Competition. He has an MA with distinction in creative writing and a PhD in American literature, both from the University of Hull. He currently lives in Yorkshire and is working on a follow-up to Cuddy Strip. Take it away, Rob.
Thank you very much, Mara. As Mara says, my novel is called Cuddy Strip. I've got a notice saying my bandwidth has gone low. Hopefully you can all still hear me. Those of you, Simon, yeah, you're nodding, that's good.
Yeah.
Right, good. Yeah, so Cuddy Strip, it's, as Mara says, it's based on true crimes in Perth in 1935. And it's a story that's haunted me from when I first read about it, because of the treatment of one of the victims, a young woman called Marjorie Fenwick. And Marjorie was the subject of systematic misogyny throughout the whole process, from the night of the crime through to the conviction of the culprit 4 months later. And at each step, I have absolutely no doubt the authorities believed they were doing the right thing. But the impact on this young woman must have been profound. And my question for tonight is, 85 years later, have we moved on? On the night of the crimes, Marjorie and her boyfriend, Danny Kerrigan, were walking on the Cuddy Strip, which is a lover's lane on the outskirts of Perth. Danny was shot dead and Marjorie was raped. But sadly, this was only the start of her ordeal. When she underwent a physical examination on the night of the attack, the police surgeon concluded that she wasn't a virgin when it happened. This then became a major feature of the investigation and subsequent trial. 2 further internal examinations of Marjorie's private parts were undertaken in the next 2 weeks. And at the trial, the judge, Lord Chief Justice Aitchison, who's a very notable figure in Scottish legal history, he advised the jury that this girl has clearly made terrible mistakes in her life, and you must therefore decide whether or not her testimony is reliable. Obviously, the matter of her virginity was completely irrelevant. She was raped, her boyfriend was murdered, she was the victim. Yet it was made the central feature of her trial. Her trustworthiness, indeed her entire character, were publicly and baselessly called into question. It strikes me that a major failing of the authorities in this case was an empathy deficit. They simply didn't consider the impact of what they were doing on this young woman. So the question is, are we any better today? In 2017, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prosecution in Scotland undertook a review of the investigation and prosecution of sexual crimes. A recent follow-up expressed concern about, firstly, the length of time taken to investigate and prosecute sexual crime cases, and secondly, the information and support provided to victims at various stages in the process. Now, the first of these problems could reasonably be argued to be the result of the underfunding that Tom has talked about. But that's a less sustainable argument when it comes to poor communication. And here, I think there are uncomfortable resonances with the empathy deficit faced by Marjorie Fenwick. This may be caused by a lack of understanding of the impact of violence against women and girls. In 2018, Sarah Thornton, then the chair of the National Police Chiefs Council, argued that the focus should be on core policing. Forces are too stretched, she said, and can't do everything. While everyone can sympathise with the underlying issue of resources, and Tom has already articulated that very eloquently, I still think Thornton's response is concerning. Yes, police should be concentrating on solving crime, especially violent crime. No one's going to argue with that. But this remains a reactive response. It doesn't address the conditions in society which give rise to behaviours which may begin with low-level misogynistic name-calling, but can escalate into violent sexual crime. Misogyny cannot be separated from sexual crime as if they're somehow unrelated. And it can't be right then for the police to focus exclusively on serious crime. Equally Safe, which is the Scottish Government strategy to prevent and eradicate violence against women and girls, declares primary prevention to be the priority. That is, stopping violence against women and girls from happening in the first place. It's difficult, I think, to reconcile that ambition with any notion that, in Thornton's words, investigating gender-based hate crime is not a priority. Part of the problem may be the culture of the police force itself. As recently as 2018, 2 high-profile sexual discrimination cases against Police Scotland were in the news, and the complainants talked of an ingrained culture of sexism in the force. In October 2019, a group of male officers were investigated over sexist bullying of female colleagues in Forres. When STV News asked Police Scotland to comment on the perception that a culture of misogyny still exists in some parts of the organisation, they did not respond. Sometimes silence says more than words. Commenting on this case, Angela Wilson, formerly the Assistant Chief Constable of Tayside, told STV News, "Things indeed may have changed, but clearly they've not changed sufficiently. This is not an isolated case. There needs to be a look at the culture and how cultural change can be effected." And it was, of course, brave of Miss Wilson to speak out about sexism, because when she did so on a previous occasion, a year before, she was branded by the General Secretary of the Scottish Police Federation as useless and one of the most incompetent imbeciles ever to have held rank in the police service. Police Scotland, to their credit, called these words inappropriate and offensive. But understanding the implications of the words we use and the way we use them is a fundamental social skill of any public servant or official, and it's hard not to see deep-rooted underlying sexism in the SPF representative's response. In September of this year, 10 police officers lost an appeal against discriminatory action relating to the sharing of racist, anti-Semitic and sexist messages on WhatsApp. Explaining the judgment, Lord Bannatyne ruled that the messages could undermine public confidence that police in Scotland were unbiased and respected people's race, sexuality and disabilities. Now, racism, of course, is an issue that's been very much in the news this year. The events in America, the death of George Floyd at the hands of police officers, the resulting protests, the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement, all have a powerful resonance. We can't know how yet, but we do know it will change society in some way. And it's easy for us on this side of the Atlantic to say things are better here. George Floyd wouldn't happen here. But the terrible story of Sheku Bayo, who died after being restrained by police officers in Kirkcaldy in 2015, should warn us against complacency. A public inquiry into that event has been announced, chaired by Lord Brackadale, and it's essential this inquiry uncovers the truth, whatever that might be. Tom referred in his opening remarks to Dame Eilish Angiolini's review, which was published last week. It's a review of the police complaints and misconduct system. And it's a hard-hitting review in some respects. And in it, she calls for a fundamental overhaul of the police complaints system. The current system lacks transparency and proper accountability and is too complex, while the powers given to the Police Investigations and Review Commissioner, who investigates complaints against the police, are weak and confused. And she did also highlight, and Tom is right to point out, it is a small part of a very large report, but she did point out, in her words, very worrying evidence of the mistreatment of Black and minority ethnic officers and discrimination against female and LGBTQ officers. She reported that the evidence of many BME officers, again in her words, was a chastening reminder that in the police service and in the wider community, attitudes have not changed as much as they should have since the 1999 Macpherson report, or as much as we may like to believe they have. And she concludes, and that's why I think it's important to mention this, she concludes that a fundamental review of equalities in Police Scotland is needed. And however hard-hitting Angiolini's review is, it shouldn't really come as an enormous surprise. A report published in July by Runnymede Perspectives, which had contributions by the Royal Society of Edinburgh, universities, MSPs, recorded a senior officer of Police Scotland describing the force as institutionally racist. And it was further alleged that the claim was suppressed at the behest of the Scottish Government because it was concerned how that would look in the press. Now, for me, this is, I think, extremely problematic. Such reluctance to face issues creates an environment in which racism or sexism or any other antisocial beliefs can prevail. When organisations are blind to the shortcomings or won't confront them, this malignancy will fester and deepen. All individuals and organisations exist within the context of the culture of the society to which they belong, and they must inevitably, to some extent, reflect that culture. There are bad apples in all walks of life, and we can't exempt the police from that and expect them to be saints. To do so would be to set them up to fail. But we must accept and acknowledge that weaknesses do exist. I think there's much to be proud of in Police Scotland, but I don't think it should be afraid to expose what is wrong and to confront it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob. So now our last speaker of the evening, Simon McLean, is a retired detective whose memoir, The 10%, is a frank and thought-provoking look at the police service in an ever-changing modern Scotland. His tales of trouble and triumph are told with classic Scots wit as the reader rides along with McLean as a rookie cop in the north of Scotland and feels the thrill of working undercover in Glasgow's serious crime squad. Simon has been outspoken in his support of drug legislation, having described his first-hand experience in the war on drugs on Sean Atwood's True Crime podcast, STV News, and more. Over to you, Simon.
Thanks very much, Mara, and good evening, everyone. And thank you very much, Book Week Scotland, and of course, Ringwood Publishing for this opportunity. Although I do have to follow Messrs. Wood and McInroy, which is a bit of a blow. But tonight, I want to virtually come out live. Let me explain. As alluded to by Tom, policing by consensus forms the very foundation of our police service here in Scotland. And that cooperation of the majority makes our style of policing possible and the envy of the world. We are, always have been, and surely must remain a part of the very communities that we serve. And that foundation is a requirement to any future of Police Scotland. When our police aren't visible, aren't approachable, when we have to hold on 20 minutes to speak to a civilian in a call centre, when we don't see officers on our streets, and they no longer attend more routine incidents, that's when mistrust can breed, and that foundation can be weakened. And it's when that consensus becomes vulnerable. To my mind, the only way we can reinforce or even rebuild that trust, including the issues that Rob has raised here tonight, is on our streets, in our communities, in our schools, and on our housing estates, where the problems actually lie, where we can be visible, proactive, and seen to be firmly on the side of the victims of crime, not by managing the message, but by confronting the very issues head on, as we've always done. And it's the only way, in my mind, that we can restore and reinforce public confidence. The list of victims is long, but tonight I want to focus on a group who remain largely invisible to us, a group who languish in our prisons, wander our streets like zombies, and very often sleep in those very streets. Tragically, over 1,200 of them die on those streets every year here in Scotland. These are some of the disenfranchised victims of the so-called war on drugs, who have no say in this future we're discussing tonight. I was on the front line of this war for many years, and so I feel qualified to come out and state categorically and publicly that the war we waged and continue to wage since criminalising drug use in Scotland wasn't only ineffective in fighting the problem of drug abuse and addiction, it was actually instrumental in creating the black market that has since supported the gangsters and purveyors of organised crime in this country. Listen, the evidence and proof surround us. Police officers, health workers, parents, prison staff, even the wains in the street, we all know the truth. Drug users themselves would rather source their drugs from regulated sources than from profiteering dealers. The war on drugs was never winnable. It was actually counterproductive. Every time we made a seizure or an arrest, we simply brought the laws of supply and demand into play. I spent the bulk of my working life thinking that I was doing some good as a detective and undercover operative, fighting the war on drugs on the front line. Now, I think it's a war of mugs. We helped fuel the black market that prohibition led to, a now thriving international market worth billions of pounds. Unfortunately, I helped create that. There are many other victims who I feel I need to cite here tonight. The parents of those addicts, their partners and children, often consigned to a life of poverty and hopelessness. Not forgetting the taxpayers among us who meet the financial cost of this war of mugs, estimated at £15 billion per annum in the UK alone. Finally, the group of victims that I've left to last, the frontline officers and agents whose task it is to enforce these draconian historic laws that are not fit for any sensible purpose and most certainly don't form any part of any strategic plan. Who would wage a war or go into a battle without a designated endgame, without at least a chance of success? Just accepting the inevitable casualties without an exit strategy or a satisfactory outcome, without a plan or any way of measuring its success or otherwise? The answer we all know is politicians who have no stake in this other than votes. So let's get tough on this. Let's go to battle. Let's just think about it. We ask officers and agents to risk everything, sacrifice much of their lives, their futures, families, and their own mental health, knowing full well that they can never win this war. Every time they make a bust or seizure, they simply create a hole in the supply chain. The demand remains exactly the same, and so the hole is quickly fought over and filled by the many dealers and gangsters awaiting that very opportunity. Make no mistake, in this blackest of markets, created through our prohibition, the stakes are very high and the profits available are astronomical. And some of us who have been unfortunate enough to work in this abyss know firsthand how ruthless and cutthroat a world it is that we tolerate in our society. We also know that the supply of illicit drugs is not an isolated activity, not by a long stretch. There are no boundaries for cartels, gangs, and mobsters. Firearms, protection rackets, money laundering, people trafficking, hijacking, smuggling, prostitution, intimidation, major fraud, robbery, murder, corruption, they're all part of their day and daily business. We not only fuel and stoke the very marketplace that created these people, but we allow our children to go to them when they decide to try or experiment with the drugs that we prohibit. Surely we need a new approach. After 50 years of prohibition, surely it's had its day. Let's at least try to find a new answer. It's for these reasons that I've decided to come out and state tonight that I'm joining an organization called LEAP, the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. There's that word partnership again, Tom. Where our mission is to reduce the multitude of harmful consequences resulting from our current drug policies, to lessen the incidence of death, disease, crime, and addiction. We are advocating an evidence-based policies with a public health focus for drugs and mental health. Many things that we use, consume, or take part in are risky or even dangerous. Regulation is about managing risk and offers a tried and tested means of protecting people, especially the young and the vulnerable. We've used these methods of protection for hundreds of years. Tobacco, gambling, and alcohol being the most obvious areas that spring to mind. Through this evidence-led approach, we can regulate where and how our drugs are manufactured and prepared, the potency and amounts that are supplied. We can control who is licensed to prepare and manufacture them, and crucially, we can license those that we trust to supply them. We can decide who can access them and in what quantities, monitor that supply and provide services where it's required, at source. We would have a measure of control, something that we have never achieved in more than 50 years of worldwide enforcement. No more pursuing low-level drug users who currently languish in prisons at great expense. £43,000 per annum was the latest estimate per prisoner. No more risking lives and throwing billions of pounds into task forces and operations, sometimes over many years, in order to penetrate and bring down sophisticated supply chains. No more abandonment of our children and most vulnerable to the greedy clutches of criminals and profiteers. I firmly believe that Scotland can prosper and reinvest the huge sums that are wasted in this useless war. With proper leadership, consultation, and planning, we can learn from the many countries across the globe where a new approach is working and create a caring environment where we can work together for the common good and help create a Scotland that we can all be proud of. Where our police can get back on the beat, back into our communities, back to their core functions that have served us so well and created a renowned Scottish police force, envied and replicated across the globe. To this end, I'm not only joining LEAP UK, but tonight I'm announcing the birth of LEAP Scotland and issuing a rallying cry for help. It's surely time that we forced our so-called leaders to address these issues, to listen to the majority who want a fresh, considered, evidence-based approach. In creating LEAP in Scotland, we can also remain in Europe as part of the growing family who are realising that we have choices here. We can be proactive, we can protect our children and their children's futures. Across the continent in 2021, we'll be seeing meetings and conventions where people from all backgrounds will be making our voices heard. We want change now. I've got a friend, Andy, he's a retired electrician, and he's just read my book, The 10%. I had to mention it at some point, didn't I? And where I discussed some of the issues that have been mentioned here tonight by all of us. And he said to me yesterday, Simon, I don't know where I've been for 40 years. I had no idea this stuff was going on all around me. Now that's a good thing. That shows that our police are doing the job we pay them to do. They deal with the ruthless, the parasites, the perverts, while the Andys of our world go about their daily business. Well, I'd like to change that. I want Andy and every other right-minded, honest individual who wants a better Scotland moving forward to make their voice heard through LEAP Scotland. Let's force our so-called leaders to listen and take action. Let's regulate the manufacture and supply, license the outlets, ensure the product is of a safe purity and strength, monitor the users and intervene when prevention could be our aim. Let's free our police force to rebuild the trust and respect they require to tackle the many modern day problems of a progressive Scotland. Let's end this phony and pointless war of mugs and at a stroke destroy the black markets that undermine all of our lives every minute of every day. Decriminalise, regulate and control. I firmly believe that that's the way forward for policing in a modern Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon, and thank you so much once again to all our speakers. I think there will be plenty of questions and plenty of remarks brewing in people's heads right about now. So I'm going to pass over to Lola, our debate convener for the evening, and Lindsay Smith, who will be assisting her.
Thank you very much, Mara, and thank you to our speakers. I wanted to start by just giving everyone the chance to respond to everything that's been said by the others so far, starting with you, Tom, if you would like.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll start with Simon. First of all, Simon, I enjoyed your presentation very much, and I enjoyed your book very much. It rang a lot of bells. It's a super book, and I agree wholeheartedly with your comments and what you say about the drug trade. Like you, I'm of the generation that fought that drugs war, and we filled the prisons, and I don't think we didn't make the situation any better. For sure. A couple of issues. I worked in drug policy after I left the police for a couple of years, and there's a couple of issues. One is what we used to talk about as the toothpaste problem, or the toothpaste question. And that is, there is a fear and concern about if you deregulate or you legalise certain drugs, what's going to happen? What are the consequences going to be? Are the criminals involved in the drug trade, are they going to pack up shop and get decent jobs? Unlikely, unlikely. Are they going to diversify? Are they going to go into dealing in more difficult, more dangerous, more harmful drugs? And we've seen this with cannabis. I mean, the cannabis that you and I were confiscating from people as young cops way back when is nothing like the skunk cannabis that's on the market just now. Which is 40 times stronger. And then you've got new products like street Valium and all these sort of things. So the real worry is we don't know what the consequences are going to be, and then how do you get the toothpaste back in the tube? Once you've released the top, once you've legalized, once you've taken any sort of controls off, how do you put it back again? You can't. And you see the city of Amsterdam just now trying to claw back control, which they lost some time ago. Now, I'm only articulating, I don't happen to believe that's a legitimate reason for not following radical reviews like you've said. I'm only saying that's one of the big issues that comes of it. Now, The other thing to say is that, unfortunately, this is not a political priority in Scotland today. It's 10 years since we had a cabinet ranking drug minister. It's 10 years since we had the road to recovery, which was the last big drug strategy. Now, every year that the drug deaths figures come out, which are appalling, worse than Western Europe, absolutely appalling. We get the same old words, wailing and gnashing of teeth. But at the same time, budgets for drug services have been cut by something like 30% over that intervening period. So there's a big gap between talk and action. But there is some room for optimism. First of all, many more countries and parts of countries are taking this radical move. I noticed with interest that the state of Oregon in the United States at the presidential elections there, one of the things they also voted for was a decriminalization of drugs across a wide spectrum, including some quite hard drugs. So there will be more examples for us to look at and see where things have gone right and things have gone wrong. The other thing is that young people are actually turning away from drugs and alcohol now, more than they were in our generation, certainly. That's very encouraging. I think that a lot more young people have just decided that they're not going to go down that road. And as you very correctly said, you know, demand is the thing. It's got to be demand that's curtailed, because as long as there's demand, there will be a supply. And the last very positive note to end on is that we in Scotland, we can do these things. We can do these things. Look at what we did with smoking in public places. I remember when that was first mooted, there was going to be this ban on smoking in public places. And oh dear, all hell was going to break loose. There was going to be public order situations, etc., etc., etc. And you know what? It didn't happen. And now, when you see someone, when you go abroad or go somewhere else and you see someone smoking in a pub and restaurant, it's like an alien thing happening. Very, very quickly, we have adapted to that new way of living, so we can do it. And I encourage you and I applaud you for taking this move. And I wish you every great success, because I think that you're right. There has to be an honest and frank look at the policies, and then there has to be courage in actually taking these stands. So well done.
Thanks very much, Tom. Just, I'm not going to even go near all that stuff, because we want to open the debate up to other people as well and hear what hear what people think out there. The only thing I would say is that I'm not putting myself forward as an expert on addiction or an expert on social issues or health issues or any of these things. What I am an expert on is catching drug dealers. Mm-hmm. And that's what I spent most of my career doing. And an expert in the consequences of the market that we have. I think the starting point for me is not to provide all these solutions. What I want is a debate. What I want is to be honest. And the starting point has to be, this isn't working. This war on drugs is 50 years old and it hasn't worked. And there's no sign that we now know it can't work because of the way it is. So let's get everybody together and find the solutions and not take all the toothpaste out the tube at one time. Let's take some out onto the brush and use it and build the thing properly. Do what we're good at in Scotland, is leading the world in innovation and coming up with ways of working together in partnership.
I quite agree, Simon, and I wish you the very best. I don't disagree with anything you've said.
Thanks, Tom.
Could I just say a word or two about to Rob now? First of all, Rob, I enjoyed Courage Strip very much. It struck me that it was incredible that investigation and that crime was occurring at exactly the same time as the Roxton crimes. And you could not have had a completely different investigation. It's so funny. I mean, they were happening, 150 miles apart. And yet the approach taken was completely different, which I suppose that highlights sort of the almost like the patchwork quilt of quality that there was at that time. And even when Simon and I were young cops, it was exactly the same as that. And it really did strike a resonance. One or two things about what you said is, first, just draw your attention to one thing. You talked about domestic violence. It's an area that's very close to my heart because I'm chairman of the board of a domestic violence charity. 20% of victims of domestic violence in Scotland are men. 30% of victims of domestic homicide in Scotland are men. And I think that we've got to be very careful that we look at all the nuances of domestic violence and not present it as simply a male-female thing where the females are always victims and the perpetrators are always men. There's a whole lot of subtle nuances in between that, which I think are significant. Secondly, can I just point out, you mentioned Sheikh Abayu, and I saw during the thing, and Sheikh Abayu, I hesitate to talk about Sheikh Abayu because there's a public inquiry. Lord Brackadale, as you say, is going to be talking about that recently. But you said something, and I saw that in the papers the weekend as well, that Sheikh Abayu died after sustaining injuries, etc., from the police from his arrest. Sheikh Abayu died from an ingestion of dangerous drugs. That's what the death certificate says. That's what he died of. And again, coming back to my very starting remarks, just about how we've got to be very, very careful. I think you talked about taking great care with language. I think we really have got to take great care with language. And I think we've got to watch that we don't fall victim to the propagandists. So I just to point that out. Sexual crime. Look, I tell you what, I was involved in the CID for a long, long time, up until the rank of detective superintendent, etc. And I investigated a lot of sexual crimes and a lot of rapes. And I found them extremely difficult to investigate, because unless you had forensic evidence, you tended not to have any kind of corroboration. And the search for evidence, and that's what the job was, the search for evidence meant that you had to ask hard questions, and meant that you had to go to places and try to ascertain things that you didn't feel comfortable in doing. And we had a very good women and child unit and very good sexual offences officers in my day, which they didn't have, of course, in 1935. But it's very, very difficult. And one of the reasons it's difficult is because we're here in the 21st century, Rob, working in a legal framework from the 19th century. And it just so happens, I knew you were going to be talking about it, so it just so happens, I'm doing research just now into a new book about prostitution, and I'm reading, it just shows you what I do for fun. I'm reading a police manual from 1884. There it is there, 1884 police manual. And the definition of rape in this book in 1884 is exactly the same definition as we are using now. Right? Now, this is before there was any knowledge of coercive control. The date rape was a thing nobody could even conceive of. And this is still the definition that we're operating under in the criminal justice system of Scotland. And I think, Simon's made a very good case for having a really good look at the Misuse of Drugs Act as being obsolete. I say, well, if that's obsolete, I think we should be taking a very long, hard look at the common law of rape and the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1884, which is still one of the main principal statutes. Because the problem is that one of the reasons why we don't get as many convictions for these sexual offences as we ought to and as we should, is because juries look at these definitions and hear these arguments, and they are uncertain and they turn away. And most European countries have reviewed considerably and overhauled their sexual offences laws. And there's a resistance to do that here. Campaigners say they don't want to do that because it waters down the principle. And I understand that. But one of the consequences of that lack of law commission looking at these definitions of rape and other offences like that is that an awful lot of victims fall through the cracks, that we don't get convictions where we should get them. And in fact, the Crown don't prosecute cases. Remember that the Crown not only act in the public interest, but they also have a sworn duty only to present cases which have got a reasonable chance of conviction. So for all sorts of reasons, I think we've got to modernise and look long and hard about a lot of our definitions and the framework in which we operate. And like Simon said, in terms of drugs, there are good examples out there. There are good examples in Scandinavia. There are good examples. There are good examples in some of the low countries. It's not like we've got to reinvent the wheel here. There are places we can go if we really want to modernise and uprate our legal system.
All right, Rob, would you maybe like to sort of respond to that and then share your primary response to that?
Yeah, in view of the time, I'll not respond to what Tom's just said. I'll just restrict myself to the presentations. In Tom's presentation, he talked of partnerships, seen and unseen, and I really would echo the importance of that. I work in a local authority in my day job, so I come at this from the view of child protection and drug and alcohol from a local government perspective. Mm-hmm. And I've seen a huge improvement over the past few years in joint working between partner agencies, and particularly between local authority and police. Not just in obvious areas like safeguarding, Section 47 strategy discussions and so on, but in some of the preventative and early intervention work that we do together. There's one award-winning project that I've been involved with, which is headed by Humberside Police in Yorkshire, and that targets frequent flyers who are constantly being dealt with by police. Investment in prevention and early intervention work there has reduced that by an enormous amount, about 70-odd%. So there are real benefits to be had from that, and societal benefits as well. And turning to Simon, he points out the obvious flaw basically in the system in drugs legislation. It simply is unworkable. Whenever a deal is removed, somebody else is going to step in. That's just the way of things. Nature abhors a vacuum. Meanwhile, again, nothing has been done about the problem at the source, reducing the number of people who become dependent in the first place, doing that early intervention and prevention work again. I know in the local authorities, drug and alcohol teams have had their funding slashed. Tom has talked about the funding problems in the police service. So we've ended up in this ceaseless cycle of arrest and imprisonment. And it's been going on for so long, it's a generational thing now. I think there are things that we can do. If you look at Portugal, for example, they've gone down this route as early as 2001, and they're at the position, our deaths from drug and alcohol are 50 times what they are in Portugal. So there's things we can learn, I think, from other countries. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Simon, would you like to share your primary response?
Let's open this up to the public. I want to hear what we've got to say. They're fed up listening to us, I think.
All right, so I have a question from Katie saying, Rob's excellent novel, Cuddy Strip, addresses the horrific treatment of sexual assault victims by the police. Do you believe that this is still an issue with contemporary Scottish policing, and what measures should be taken to protect victims? And maybe, Rob, you could respond initially to that, considering.
Well, I'll kick off, but obviously my two colleagues are going to know far more about this than I will. I don't think we'd see the casual way that Marjorie was treated happening now. However, I did mention in my presentation the Inspectorate of Prosecution suggesting there was a problem with communication, the speed of communication and the amount of communication. So I think there are things that still need to be learned about this. But I'll pass over to Simon and Tom.
Any takers?
Simon's on mute if he's speaking.
I wasn't speaking, but I am now.
All right.
I think the sensible way to look at this, and it's easy to look at it from the outside when you're not part of it anymore. And in some ways, Tom will know what I mean here, that you can have a much more considered and subjective view of it when you're not in there, part of it anymore. Because to be honest, in the teams that I worked in, especially latterly, We were so busy getting the job done that there was no time. There was never any talk of anything like this. Everybody got included, but part of that teamwork and part of that bonding, anybody who's listening here who's ever been part of a football team or a rugby team or a darts team or any kind of enterprise that entails people getting together for common purpose, then there's language that becomes your language in there. There's in-jokes that become your jokes. And when you're in and amongst that, you've no time to think about what's happening. You're just getting the job done. Now we can sit back and look back with the luxury of hindsight, which is a fantastic gift, and look at some of the mistakes that we made. And Rob's absolutely right, some of the language, but that goes for my parents and my grandparents as well. And it's a societal thing to look at the police and say, oh, the police have got a problem here. To my mind, and I might be a way out on a limb here from everyone else, to my mind, you get the police that society is a reflection of. The people that we recruit are just you and I off the street. Tom mentioned 21, 22, 23-year-old, what I would call kids. I'm sorry to the girls that are on here running this thing tonight, but that's what they are to me. And these people are out in the streets, some of them in charge of someone else who's just joined. And that's the people that are making these life and death decisions, crucial decisions day and daily. So it's very easy to be critical of them, but we need to remember that they're only a product of the schools and universities that they came from to join the police.
Okay, can I just say, Simon, in relation to that question about are things perfect now in relation to victims of sexual crime? No, they're not. Of course, they're not. The minute that you think that issues are being dealt with perfectly, then you're heading for a fall. I don't think they're perfect. What I can tell you for sure is they are hugely improved, out of all recognition, improved over time. From when I was a young officer, and even from the time I was a senior officer, they have improved and are improving. And could they be improved further? Yes, of course they could. And you've got to keep trying. You've got to keep trying. But I say again, one of the problems is we're up against this framework of 19th century law. And at the end of the day, the police service are there to gather evidence and report to the court, report to the fiscal and the Crown and the court. And so, when you're up against this 19th century framework, you've got to gather that evidence, and you've got to ask questions, and you've got to conduct the investigation thoroughly. Otherwise, you're failing in your duty. And sometimes that's hard.
In a way that's perhaps related, there's a question here from Megan saying thank you for the excellent presentations, but also, in the age of social media, what do you say to the idea of scrutiny to policing in Scotland in the court of public opinion? Is it making things harder for the police to effectively do their jobs? Or is this kind of scrutiny valuable to ensuring policing that aligns with public needs?
Well, maybe that affects my presentation as much as anybody else's. I don't know if there is a court of public opinion on social media. I think we make a big mistake if we think that social media are representative of our general population. I think they might be the loudest voice, but I don't necessarily think they're representative. They make it very difficult, can I tell you, to be candid and to be open, because social media is a very, very blaming culture. And so Rob there spoke, and he's absolutely right, a time for openness and candor about what mistakes we're making and how we go forward and how we improve ourselves. That's becoming harder and harder in the very, very harsh environment of social media. Tom,
could I pass this to Simon?
Yeah, the social media thing, Tom, you're absolutely right. And the one thing I would point out about it is the echo chamber effect, because people tend to like and befriend and become associated with like-minded people. Yeah. And then when someone says something, lots of people agree with them quite naturally. You don't get two sides of an opinion very often. Having said that, the flip side of the coin is that in launching Leap Scotland tonight, which is part of Leap UK and part of Leap Europe, and it started in the USA, as you would imagine, it's a huge organization. then I'm going to try and harness the social media because it cuts across the whole spectrum. If you can find ways of sharing and getting the message out, you'll find those like-minded people that will come on board and can make one voice, which is what we're trying to do. So it's always a flip side. There's always two sides to every coin.
All right, I've got a question building off of that. Do you think the police are adequately trained to cope with digital media and as such also cybercrime? Is the digital literacy of the police force adequate in the current climate?
Well, I think Tom has to answer that because I've got absolutely no idea. All the ex-cops that I know can hardly work email, never mind anything else.
I think it's a game of perpetual catch-up. I think that we've got very good resources in Police Scotland. We've got a very good cybercrime unit, but such is the scale of the problem and such is the pace of development that I think it will be, as I say, it will be a game of chase all the time. And it's going to be the problem and the issue that defines this and coming generations. There's no doubt about it.
I have a question for Rob here, although others may have an interesting contribution. Is there perhaps a conceptual problem with the idea of police discrimination? Arguably, a police officer's job in reality is to make snap judgments about people, i.e. arbitrarily discriminate. The composition of the Scottish jail population would suggest that this is done on basis of class first and foremost. I wondered if that was anything you found personally interesting.
It's not something I know anything about, I have to say. The idea of police discrimination, I'm sure there will be elements of discrimination because all of us have some sort of biases, whether conscious or unconscious. Whether that is represented in the prison population, I couldn't say.
It was directed to you, but I'm glad to bounce it off of Simon and Tom as well.
Okay, can I just say something that I think that's right. You know, people talk about gut instinct. People talk about, you know, having this, you know, second sight experience. It's actually a condition of what you're learning and goes in your head. And so when you come up to a situation and you have something in your head says, well, I've met this situation before and this is how it went and that's how you respond. And I think that's fairly well understood. What I would say to you is this, that during the 1980s, I was a member of the Serious Crime Squad and we chased bank robbers all over Scotland. Simon will remember this period, the shotgun bank robberies, and we chased them all, and we thought that was absolutely the very, very important thing to do. And I suppose it was. But you know what? At the time we were chasing these bank robbers who had the courage to go into a bank with a shotgun and try and rob it and face the consequences of what they'd done. At the same time, there were people in the financial institutes of Scotland who were robbing the country blind and who were doing an awful lot more damage than any bank robber ever did. And we never looked at them, never looked near them. And I remember when I was in the Serious Crime Squad laughing at my fraud squad associates, people in the fraud squad say, oh, fraud squad, you know, come on, you know, fraud squad. And one or two of them said to me, look, you know, actually, company fraud, white collar crime, is much more harmful and damaging than, you know, honest bank robbers, as it were. And I wouldn't have believed it. Wouldn't have believed it for a minute. You know what? They were absolutely right. They were absolutely right.
Can I ask a question just to come in quickly in terms of that notion of who's goodies and who's baddies? There's a question here for Simon initially about, do you think you wasted your career fighting the war on drugs? Is that a time you reflect on with regret, or do you think it really shaped your present viewpoint?
Well, there's two answers to that, Lindsay. The first one is because I'm launching Leap Scotland, I want to be controversial, I want some headlines, I want to cause some discussion about it. And it was an inspector in Scandinavia that I had heard a quote that he said he thought he had wasted 32 years of his life as a police officer trying to enforce these draconian drug laws. So my headline is, yes, I wasted my career. It was a total waste of time. I want my life back because of that Misuse of Drugs Act. But the truth of the matter is that all crime is related, and criminals don't have any boundaries about what types of crimes they commit or where they commit them, okay? So to try and pigeonhole things and say that's drugs over there and that's thieving over there, or robberies or people trafficking or whatever it happens to be, when you get into organised crime, drugs is only a part of the big picture. I'll give you a good example. We had a murder in the Wine Alley in Govan once, and we were getting nowhere after 2 or 3 days, and Tom will relate entirely to this. We were getting nowhere. It was a brick wall, because sometimes when very serious criminals are involved, nobody wants to rise their head above the parapet for obvious reasons. So our SIO made a decision to flood the place with police officers, uniform and CID, and start doing everybody in the area for playing football in the street. You know, you couldn't do anything for a few days because of the amount of police officers that were there, executing outstanding warrants and doing all of that stuff. And basically we forced the community to do what we needed them to do and give us the guy we were after. And that's the answer to your question, is about the good guys and bad guys.
So there's a supplementary question in the chat there about, do you think society, and as a consequence the police, works with an oversimplified belief that you can divide the world into goodies and baddies, and therefore who's the baddies? That's what we really want to know.
I'll jump in here because it's a kind of joke that we used to have in the Serious Crime Squad between us. That was that very notion that you could tell whether somebody was a good guy or a bad guy. It's like that comedy program that used to be on, good guy, good guy, good guy. Remember all that? Well, that was the same in the police, but it was a kind of standard joke that you could read something into somebody's character by the fact that they wore spectacles, or the fact that they wore a tracksuit, but we've all been found out. Every single police officer that ever served and walked the beat has been found out by that stereotyping. It catches you out all the time. So the police, probably more than anyone, don't do the good guy, bad guy thing. They take things at face value, and they speak, if they're doing their job properly, they speak to people all the same and take the factual information that can be taken from that.
Yeah. I think there's a lot in that. And for me, I think it's largely a political thing, because it's an easy political fix. The firm hand of the law being really firm on things goes right back to Willie Whitelaw. If you remember 1979, the short, sharp shock. It's great for the politicians. It sounds like they're really on top of things. They're being really tough, and it is simplistic in the extreme, and it puts police officers in a very, very difficult position.
But the war on drugs, I give you the war on drugs, that was President Nixon. Although it was started long before him, but he was the guy that came out in 1971 and said, we're going to have a war on drugs. And it caught on because it's got that short, sharp shock benefit to it. Just political nonsense.
Can I just add something that for many years in my force we investigated the what they call the World's End murders. I wrote books about the World's End murders, and eventually when we identified the man responsible, a man called Angus Sinclair, he's dead now. I had all sorts of ideas about what Angus Sinclair would be, and the first time I met Angus Sinclair, it was just a little inconsequential wee man that you'd have passed 9 times out of 10 in the street. He was one of the, if not the most dangerous men that walked the face of Scotland in the 20th century. And I tell you, you'd have walked past him 99 out of 100 and never paid him any heed.
Mr. Ferris, who's my new Twitter friend.
Oh, right. Aren't you lucky?
He called him Babyface. He was just like a wee boy.
Right.
What a dangerous man.
There
Perhaps to sort of round off our bits of questions on the topic of appearances, Rob, you were asked if you think that the police force in Scotland is institutionally racist.
Right. To be honest, I think the term itself is kind of unhelpful. I mean, the term institutionally racist, it came about in the Macpherson report into Stephen Lawrence and the Metropolitan Police's handling of that case. And so it therefore has some really, really heavy baggage with it. People see what happened there, and they see the behaviour of the Met that was uncovered there, and they say, we're not like that. We're different from that. And in fairness to Police Scotland, they're not. But what I think then happens is there is a tendency for them to kind of shy away from the debate, and they dissociate themselves from it. And in so doing, I think they probably deny more of their failings than they should, and they don't confront problems that they should. So I don't think they display the tendencies that you can see and you could see in the Met, but that's not to say there's nothing troublesome there. If you go back to the Sheku Bayo case, and Tom's right, obviously we do have an inquiry coming in, so we need to be careful about that. But his sister, Katie Johnson, she said she believed that Police Scotland was institutionally racist. And what she said was the way they treated him and the way they treated us as a family, all of that proved that race was involved in his death. And I think that's significant because it suggests an ongoing pattern of racist behaviour. It wasn't just a one-off thing.
Yeah, can I say something, Rob? That
yeah,
that institutional racism means that racism is actually sewn into the fabric of the organisation. So the Nazi Party in Germany were institutionally racist. The apartheid regime in South Africa was institutionally racist. The southern states of America pre-Civil War were institutionally racist. You know, these phrases are bandied about and are used to smear people, you know, institutionally sexist, institutionally racist. You got to be really careful that you know what you're talking about, because there's no way any organisation in the UK is institutionally racist, because that would mean they would have to have racist policies sewn into their organisation.
I agree with that, but I do think there is an element that the police just need to do a bit more thinking about it, because you can go right back to 2002, and there was a report on the experience of Black and minority ethnic police staff, both officers and ancillary staff, and it came up with a number of issues that were affecting the force. The first of those was a general lack of awareness of issues concerning racism. And what the Black and minority ethnic respondents said was that there was a lack of awareness resulted in white colleagues not understanding why some of their behaviour or language was an issue. Mm-hmm. And this manifested itself in the canteen culture. And again, this is another phrase from Macpherson, but it's also come up in the Dame Ellish review as well. We've got this light-hearted banter and jokes which often have blatant displays of racist language or sexist language, but it's so widely accepted, it's hard to counter it. Because alongside all of that, there is this pressure to belong, and that therefore perpetuates existing culture. So we've seen it in the police force for 20 years, at least, and the force has known about it. But we're still in the position where senior officers are trying to deny that the force is racist. And I take what you say about, you know, it's not built into policies, but there are issues there. The author of the Runnymede Trust paper that I talked about in my presentation, Professor Meir, he says that stakeholders who've worked with Police Scotland have a very honest and frank relationship with them, and they can discuss very difficult issues with them. But there's a reticence for the police force to talk publicly about these issues because of the negative headlines. So my view is, I just think the police force need to open up a little bit more. They need to acknowledge that there are some issues there.
I think you're right. I think it's not a perfect world, and I think like we were speaking about the treatment of the victims of sexual crime. I think there's always work to be done. But if this title, the smear of institutional racism, which is frankly nonsense, because you know there is a definition of institutional racism, if that keeps being thrown at organisations, not just the police, that all organisations, then people just tune out and switch off, and you're less inclined to get an open and meaningful debate, because people just say, it's just nonsense, and they walk away from it. So I think there's a careful balance to be struck there. But in terms of the Sheku Bayo case, let's I wish everybody would wait for the public inquiry. It's not sub judice, unfortunately, but it's very, very unhelpful when celebrity lawyers and others come out with these things, because they are quite intentionally designed to smear. And I don't think that does the discourse any good at all.
All right, Simon, you wanted to respond to that?
Yeah, just a final wee general point there that I'd like to keep it in mind. And it's in my mind because of the Facebook pages and things that I subscribe to, where ex-colleagues and old friends from all across the world now and their children are part of it. And we can all communicate about things and have a laugh. And some of the photographs, I saw a photograph today, Tom, of the Serious Crime Squad, the first surveillance unit in Scotland, in Strathclyde that I was in, and the haircuts alone are priceless.
I'd like to see that.
It's the first time I've seen them all sober together in one room. It's absolutely incredible. But my point is that talking to these guys, when a political view comes up, and it doesn't matter what it is or what side of the spectrum it is, there are just as many opposite views and just as many in between. And these are all retired police officers. And the same is true of every serving police officer. They have their own sexuality. They have their own views on these things. They have their own views on everything. And that's the way it should remain, because the police must be part of the community. We can't ever say to the police, you must be neutral in everything that you do. That's down to management and of promotion and departments within the police where people work. That are best suited to people. I've had dealings with police officers lately in the last year or so, and thought that they might be better being social workers. But that's me bringing my 1980s perspective to it. They actually are required to be like social workers now because of the job that they do. So let's not try and, this racism thing is, all these things are nonsense when it comes to the police, because they're all just individuals coming together with common purpose, and they all bring their own baggage from their families and from their backgrounds to it. And it's a shame to burst anyone's bubble that would like to think there is this kind of conspiracy within a conspiracy, Tom, in the police force of 23,000 people. I was lucky if I could ever get 2 or 3 to agree on one thing.
Very lucky. That was a good day.
All right, looking at the time, I think I'm going to see if you guys would like the chance to have something of an ending statement. Simon, that was close to an ending statement, but I'd still like to give you the chance to.
I've got 47 pages of ending statement here.
Oh.
Want me to start then? We'll go in reverse order this time, will we? And give Tom the last word.
Yeah, let's do that.
I don't have anything prepared as a final statement, but it's nice that it's informal anyway. The purpose of my talk tonight, I chose to use it as a platform to launch Leap Scotland. And I see some messages coming in, people wanting to get involved immediately. And there will be websites. There is already leapuk.org, and there's Leap Europe now as well. There's lots out there and lots of information that I would recommend anyone to go and look at, because it's quite shocking. Some of the reports, the Cato report and things like that have been done, all coming to the same conclusion, that we really need a think tank here. We need some people to sit down and not just give it the political run out in the press that they normally do and pay lip service to it. We actually need to make some changes here. And I would appeal to anyone out there that agrees with that. We're not looking for money, crucially. We're not looking for people to stand up on platforms. What I'll be looking for is just a statement from people to say that, yeah, I think we need to readdress this and have a modern day look at it and bring our drug laws up to date, like we do with road traffic, like we do with lots of things, and obviously like we need to do with the criminal procedures that Paul was speaking about. Thank you.
Thank you. Rob?
Okay, just to round off from me then, I agree with Tom. We need to be taking care in the way that we do this. We need to be looking at things in a sober way. But I do think the Angelini review gives us an opportunity perhaps to do that. She has called for a fundamental review of equalities in the service, that may be the mechanism for doing it. And if we do that, I think we need to make sure that we're involving the public as much as possible in some of those discussions. Because if there is a perception amongst minority groups that the force is racist, it doesn't matter whether it is or not. If that perception exists, and the evidence that was given to the Runnymede Trust suggests that it is the case in some instances, then it needs to be addressed. And that can only really happen if those minorities are included in any review and any planning that takes place. So I think there is a big opportunity, and I just want to reiterate the point I ended with. I think there's a lot for Police Scotland to be proud of.
All right, thank you very much. Finally, Tom?
Just like to say I've enjoyed tonight very much. It's been a great occasion, and it's so nice to be able to debate and talk about these things openly and candidly, and agree and disagree. And I think we need a lot more of that. That's the kind of public discourse we need. There's a lot about Twitter and social media, which is very, very unsatisfactory in terms of actually sitting and, okay, we're remote on screens, but can actually see each other face to face and hear the arguments. And we need a lot more of that. And just last word from me is, don't forget, right now as we speak, there are hundreds and hundreds of very young men and women out there. It's cold, it's dark, it's raining, making these quick decisions, and they need our support. Policing by consent means that it's got to be us as well as them. And I think we have got to be part of the police, and we've got to have a police service we can trust. And so Rob's right. I think we should look very carefully at Eilish Angelini's report, and we can always improve, and we should always be improving. But I've enjoyed myself very much, and thanks again to you for your super chairmanship, and it's been great.
Brilliant.
Thanks, girls.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. A big thank you once again to our free speakers for their interesting speeches and the fascinating conversations that were had here tonight. We will now share a link in the chat to an audience feedback form on SurveyMonkey. If you complete this form and share your feedback with us, you'll be entered in for a chance to win £250 worth of prizes. If you don't see it in the chat in time, it will be on our social media as well, so keep an eye out for it. You can complete it anytime after the event. I would once again like to thank Lola for moderating the debate and Lindsay for her help and for representing Ringwood's partnership with Arlington Baths here tonight. On a final note, I'd also like to remind everyone that each author's book is available on the Ringwood website, and there's even a special offer where you can purchase a set of all 3 books at the discounted price of £25, or a combination of any 2 out of the 3 at the discounted price of £15. So make sure you complete your collection. Thank you once again to everyone for coming along and for participating in tonight's discussion, and feel free to continue tonight's debate on Facebook or on Twitter. And remember to use the hashtag #HaveTheRight. That's all from us. Have a good night.
Thank you,
Good
Mara.
night. Good night.